And so I just want to introduce Ethelbert Miller and Joanne Gabbin. Thank you. Come right ahead.
Good to see you.
Oh, it's wonderful, wonderful to be here, Ethelbert. And it's so good to be here at a conference that honors Sterling Brown and Sterling Brown's legacy. I certainly want to thank Jonetta. This is the first time we've met, and you're a fabulous organizer. You're organizing as I'm talking to you. So I just want you to look at me and hear my thank you. This is tremendous. Thank you, Ethelbert. Okay, I hear myself very, very loudly in this, but I want to thank also Ethelbert for. You want to lower the volume a little bit? No, it's fine. It's fine. For helping to organize this program as well. Ethelbert has been a living legend in the District of Columbia. For more than 5 decades, this man has done the work, the literary and cultural work that is necessary in this particular town, and in the state, and in the country, and of course in the world. As I look out over this group, I think, my goodness, almost everyone in this room has been impacted by some program that Ethelbert has helped to put together. So I'm just pleased to be here and to talk with you. And he said, he had a lot of questions to ask me. And so I told him, and I have questions to ask him too. So don't think this is going to be a one-sided conversation.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna take you back. It's been 40 years since the publication of your book, Sterling A. Brown, Building the Black Aesthetic Tradition. Talk about the role your mentor, George Kent, played in helping you understand Brown's work. And did he encourage you to focus on certain aspects of Brown's career?
Oh, yes. Well, thank you for that question. George Kent was so significant in my getting to Sterling Brown. You might not believe this, Ethelbert, but when I went to Morgan, I had wonderful teachers, including Ulysses Lee, Eugenia Collier, Nick Aaron Ford. Some of you will remember these names. And they were brilliant teachers, Waters Turpin, but none of those teachers taught me Negro literature, as it was called then. Even though they were studying it and they were writing articles about it, they did not teach it in their classes because of the educational associations they were a part of. They didn't consider that the proper canon for this Black institution. So I had to get to the University of Chicago before I was introduced to Langston Hughes and Sterling Brown and Gwendolyn Brooks in terms of their writings. Certainly I had read Langston Hughes and Paul Lawrence Dunbar and others, but I had not studied them. So George Kent helped me to get to Sterling Brown. And I was thinking about how I went through the master's program, worked with him, and then when I got my master's, they asked me if I would go on to do the PhD. Well, you know, first generation college student, I had never even thought about doing a PhD. But I said, if you want me to do a PhD, George Kent has to be my director. And I was responsible for having George Kent stay at the University of Chicago. He was a visiting professor. You understand how these institutions will bring you in as a visiting professor, and they don't want to give you a full position, and they send you away just so they can say, I had a black professor here. Yeah, as an adjunct, exactly. Talk back to me, somebody. And so, look, I'm going to, I want to look at Ethelbert, but I want to look at you too. So, what was good about this is that I decided to stay and do the PhD at the University of Chicago. George Kent wanted me to study Gwendolyn Brooks. He was so generous. He had already started work on her. He was going to hand that work over to me. But I hesitated because we'd become friends, and I wondered whether I could have the literary distance from Gwendolyn Brooks. At the end of my master's year, my mother got very sick with cancer, and she passed away in December of 1970. I buried her in Baltimore and went back to Chicago, and the grief was deep and profound. And I was sitting reading poetry books, and I came across Southern Road. And this is the actual origin story of my interest in Sterling Brown. Sister Lou, may I?
Go ahead.
You know, we have this in the church, this song. I want a telephone in my bosom to call him up. I was sitting on the floor thinking, I need a telephone in my bosom to call my mother up. And then I read Sister Lou. Honey, when the man calls out the last train you're gonna ride, tell him howdy. Gather up your basket and your knitting and your things and go on up and visit with friend Jesus for a spell. Joshua was talking about the cracking in the voice. There's still emotion when I read this particular poem. Show Martha how to make your green grape jellies and give poor Lazarus a parcel of them golden biscuits. Scald some meal for some right down good spoon bread for little box Punk and David, and sit around and tell them Hebrew children all your stories. Honey, don't be feared of them pearly gates. Don't go around to the back. No more that away. Not ever no more. Let Michael tote your burden and your pocketbook and everything, except your Bible, while Gabriel blows something solemn and loudsome on that horn of his'n. Honey, go straight on to the big house and speak to your God without no fear and trembling. Then sit down and pass the time of day a while. give a good talking to your favorite Apostle Peter and rub the head of poor mixed up Judas and joke a while with Jordan. Then when you get the chance, always remember your raisin. Let him know you're tired, just a mite tired. Jesus will find your bed for you. Won't no servant ever bother with your room. Jesus will lead you to a room with windows opening on cherry trees and plum trees, blooming everlasting. And that will be yours for keeps. Then take your time, honey. Take your blessed time. I read that poem over and over, and I was transported to a place of peace and a place of ease. And I went to George Kent and I said, I want to write about this man. I want to write about this man who brought me comfort when I couldn't find any. I want to write about this man whose voice in this poem allows me to hear the voice of the women in my mother's community. And that's why I started working on the dissertation on Sterling Brown, not knowing about what it would take to do this work and to be in it so long. I needed to have something that I believed in. And I believed in his voice, and I believed in his connection to his people. And I would say often when I talked about Sterling Brown, I slept with Sterling Brown for 8 years. And honestly, Terry, people would look at me like, oh my God, that's brazen hussy. But I did. I worked on this book for 8 years. And I finally got to the point where I said, this is good, this is enough. And then I went to George Kent, and he said, it's not enough yet. You have to do a chapter on the Federal Writers Project. And he was right. And I went to work again. So it's, I'm still, Sterling Brown lives with me. So I can talk for the rest of the afternoon about this.
I got questions.
Okay. All right.
Okay, I'm going to go
All right.
George Kent.
Come on, bring him on.
I saw in the bibliography of your book a reference to the work of Eugenia Collier, who you mentioned.
Yes.
In 1976, Eugenia Collier completed her PhD dissertation, Steps Towards a Black Aesthetic. How helpful was Collier's work for your book?
It was extremely helpful. Even though I came up with this theme of building the Black aesthetic, as I got more into the book, after I'd written about his poetry, after I had done a deep dive into his criticism, I said, this man is explaining to me why I should value Black literature and why I should revere it. This is the truth and beauty that I was looking for. So I thought about building the Black aesthetic. In the 1930s, he had already started doing this. With the essay, Blues as Black Poetry, as poetry. He was doing this for us. And all through the 1930s, and then with the publication of the Negro Caravan, there it was there for me, a foundation that I hadn't yet been able to understand fully. He put it out there for us to see. So Eugenia was so important to me as a mentor. In fact, George Kenton, she followed my progress through my dissertation and the publication of this book. Eugenia Collier is 97 years old. I saw her 3 weeks ago. I'm so glad to tell you she still has her right mind. She said to me about 2 years ago in a letter, she said, "Joanne, it has occurred to me that I'm not going to live forever." So she says, "I have all of these papers and documents that I want someone to have, and I want them to continue my work." That started me on this concept paper that I sent to the Mellon Foundation so that I could start documenting the work of the Wintergreen women, she is one, and so that I can encourage Black women who never thought about collecting their papers and putting them in an archive to consider it. Well, a month ago, she gave me the last box of her documents that are now a part of James Madison University and the Wintergreen Archive. And they paid her for her papers. So it's wonderful to think about how these people have sown into my life.
Right. Talk about the role that folklore plays in developing this aesthetic tradition.
Folklore is the foundation. If you noticed in Sister Lou, this sounds like a sermon. It sounds like a spiritual. It's coming right out of the church. It's biblical. Sterling Brown used the spirituals. He certainly used the blues. He heard the music of the blues and put that music in his poetry. I suppose the very best example of that is Ma Rainey. Ma Rainey, I think, is one of my favorite poems in the world. And I won't take the time to read it, but those last lines, I don't know what the fella said. She just gets a hold of me some kind of way.
You know, yeah. I want to ask you a question there.
I just want to say this one thing, because you know I'm kind of frisky.
I know you.
I will turn to my husband sometimes when and I would say to him, because he understands, "Baby, you just get a hold of me some kind of way."
This leads into my next question.
Okay.
I want you to talk about how is the blues of Langston Hughes poetry differ from Langston Hughes, Sterling Brown, and then also how are the blues by men different from the blues by women?
The difference between the blues of Sterling Brown
and Langston Hughes,
and
then also the difference between the blues by blues singers who are women and blues singers that are men.
Who are men? That's a great question. When I think of the blues of Langston Hughes, I think of the blues inspired by the musicians. The blues that he must have heard in the bars. The women wearing red and twirling around, and he is inspired by that. When I think of blues by Sterling Brown, I think of a blues rooted in the feeling of melancholy, in the feelings of sadness, blues that look at the human condition in terms of struggle. I think about Ma Rainey and Backwater Blues, the blues that come after a disaster, the blues that come after the boll weevil attacks the cotton crop, the blues that come after a man like Calvin Big Boy Davis has to leave his home and he won't see his woman. Long gone, you heard that earlier. When I think about the blues for Sterling Brown, they are much more somber. They are placed in the field and in the honky-tonk.
Yeah, but you know, when I look at the poems, also by Langston and Sterling Brown, they're not the funky blues.
No.
You know, I mean,
no.
what happens is that it's the type of blues that I respect if, and I'm thinking about Langston going to the theater. I could see it on a stage, but I remember growing up, your parents had these like race records, like Red Fox and stuff, Mom's Mabley, and you couldn't hear that because it was very sexual,
Yes.
you know, and when I look at Langston, it seems like a little PG rating there.
Is a little PG in Langston's?
I think so. It's like a PG. I mean, I could share Langston's blues poems with my grandkids. Okay, there's some things that I know, blues records I can't share with my grandkids. I mean, and that's why I get into the whole thing of what women are talking about. I mean, Bessie Smith is very graphic in some of her songs.
Yeah.
Okay, and I don't see that sometimes in the literature in terms of that. Or I think about a situation when Langston was touring and he was reading in church. And he started reading some of his blues poem, and the minister came up and said, "None of that from my pulpit."
Yeah.
And Langston said that was the first time I dealt with censorship. You know?
Yeah.
So you could see that, you know, back then, this was very radical, you know, what Sterling Brown was doing, Langston using, because we had a certain blues thing. And I remember Sterling said the thing that when, I think it was Elaine Locke, somebody be singing blues in the alley, Elaine Locke would get up and close the window.
Yeah.
You know, and that just shows you something right there, that even though we're talking about blues, okay, it is a certain type of blues.
Yeah, it's the kind of blues that, my mother would sing about Jelly Roll Morton, and Jelly, Jelly, Jelly in my pot. And I would say, jelly's not in a pot. It's in a jar. And she didn't mean that, you know. But that's the kind of blues you're talking about. And women singing the blues, I think about the blues lines that inspired Sterling Brown. There's a blues line. I heard my daddy calling some other woman's name. I said, I heard my daddy calling some other woman's name. I know he don't mean me, but my answer just the same. Now, you know that's love. That's love. Somebody call, you in the midst, and he's calling somebody else's name. That's sad. But what? That's also transcendent. And that's the kind of blues that Sterling Brown dealt with, the blues of irony.
Well, let me ask you this question, and families here. Many times when we talk about Sterling Brown, we talk immediately about the blues. I was wondering whether Sterling Brown probably talked about the spirituals first, being the fact that his father was a minister, and also the fact that he's coming after the work that Du Bois had done in terms of the souls of black folks. He's holding the spirituals almost in every chapter. So I was just wondering about how do you make that move from the spirituals to the blues, or whether it was the blues to the spirituals.
I don't,
Will we
I
turn
don't
to the
know
family?
exactly, but I would think that when he went south to Lynchburg, to Virginia Seminary and College, he went there with his father's blessings and his father's hopes that he might catch the fire of ministry.
Right.
But as you know, he went there and he met Miss Bibby, and he met other people who were in the field. He met these young men who were trying to get an education, and he heard their stories. And that's when I think he decided ministry was not for him, but teaching was for him.
Well, let's focus on that for a second,
Yeah.
because we talk about Sterling Brown going into the rural areas. When we look at it further, he's going to Virginia, he's going to Tennessee, he's going to Missouri. Would it be different, would he have a different understanding of African American folklore if he was going to the deeper South, if he was going to Mississippi or Louisiana? Because we know that when we look at the federal project in the 30s, he was very much concerned about Gullah people in South Carolina. So it seems as if you look at the African American community in the rural area, it differs from state to state.
It does, but he was also very interested in what was going on in Louisiana, what was going on in Alabama, especially because of some of the portraits he painted in words. So I think the Federal Writers Project opened him up as well. You know, Imani Perry talks about going south, but of course, before she did her study on the South, Sterling Brown was doing his study. He was going to, as you talked about earlier this morning, he was going into the academy. He was going to the turpentine mines and to the coal mines. He was going to the cane fields and the corn fields and the rice fields and meeting these people who worked with their hands and then played very hard in the juke joints when they got a little relief. He saw that as his foundation. I love when somebody talked about this morning the mulch. It's a very good term for the foundation of folklore that he dug into. I would also say he composted a lot too.
Talk about, you have an excellent chapter in your book about the Federal Writers Project. Talk about the impact of Brown having access to these ex-slave narratives.
Yeah, he, through the Federal Writers Project, he saw and of course read, because they had been collected, and heard these slave narratives. And he put that information in his poetry. I think that gave him the perspective that we get so clearly in the poem Strong Men. You know the poem. Let me get to a little bit of it.
Grab your hymnal.
All right. Somebody out there has it before I can find it. But 62. I'm not going to read it all, but I just want you to hear this history that he puts in this poem. It opens, of course, the young men keep coming on, the strong men keep coming on, by Carl Sandburg. They dragged you from homeland. They chained you in coffers. They huddled you spoon fashion in filthy hatches. They sold you to give a few gentlemen ease. Talk about the slave narrative. Talk about the history that he learned, that he listened to. That whole idea of listening is extremely important. And he got that history, and he culled that history. He synthesized it, and he put it in his poems.
You know, when we look at the writer in terms of the challenge that writers have in terms of capturing black speech on the page, I'm thinking of Chestnut before Sterling Brown, then Sterling Brown, but then the challenge of getting spelling, for example, correct. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, you know, Johnson, James Weldon Johnson, when he talked about the folklore, he talked about how it had simply two stops, pathos and humor. And he was also, of course, critical of the dialect used in the poetry. You know, he was criticizing Paul Laurence Dunbar and some of the earlier poets. But then he read Langston Hughes, he read Sterling Brown. And he had to revise that introduction. And he had to say, it's more than two stops in the poetry of Sterling Brown. And he has used the language in a way that we recognize. When you read Sterling Brown, he gets the essence of the tone. He gets the essence of the dialect, but he doesn't have to use strange spellings to get us to hear. So that was another thing that I appreciated about Sterling Brown. It was clear that he wasn't trying to put obstacles in the way of our understanding his poetry, or for that matter, his prose.
Well, you know, we know that, and many of us here who heard Sterling Brown give readings, the fascinating things were in between the poems, and that's when you would get the lies. And I was wondering whether we would talk about maybe seeing Sterling Brown as a trickster, and also looking at how Sterling Brown incorporated humor into his poems.
Absolutely. I'm glad you talked a little longer. I had to get some water.
I'm gonna get some water too.
Yes. I have to tell you that Sterling Brown, for me, was the consummate humorist. When you talk with Sterling Brown, he would say things that would put everything in perspective. You know, we were talking earlier about the Harlem Renaissance, and Sterling Brown, in talking about the fact that he was left out of the Harlem Renaissance, you know that phrase.
He never went down to the dock.
He said he never even got to the dock. You know, and he did not miss the A train. He didn't get on it. He also summed up the commodification of African, this romanticism of Africa, and by saying things like, what is all this bula bula bula? I can hear him saying it right now. Or in talking about African exoticism in the person of, if you will, of Josephine Baker. He may have liked Josephine Baker, but he didn't like the fact that she was naked with bananas in front of her area. He made you laugh about these issues. He made you think about them in terms of the irony of some of that. He was not a surface person. He wanted to show you the deepness of a movement. So, you know, like Jesse Jackson would say, you know, if my blackness is not in my clothes. For Sterling Brown, the blackness was not in what you called him. His name. You know who you've read Sterling Brown. He was proud of being called a Negro. We, of course, have gone through so many name changes. But he was proud to say, I'm a Negro.
He would say he was an old Negro.
I'm a Negro. He was a race man. He says, why would I drop the title Negro when Mordecai Johnson was a Negro, when Paul Robeson was a Negro, when Marian Anderson was a Negro? And this whole idea that you talked about earlier, wonderful panel, continuity. He's about continuity. He's not about lopping off what has come before and saying he's starting something new. He was about seeing the strands that connect us as people and keep us united. And that's the reason I love his work so much. And really, in a real sense, he's also an inspiration for the way I built Furious Flower. Furious Flower was built on the concept that we have generations of poets who are linked together because they have mentored one another and they have learned from one another. And so that was the whole idea of building that particular
I'm glad
conference.
you said that, because I want to
Yeah.
take what you just said about Furious Flower and take that back to the Federal Writers Project and have you talk about some of the writers that were involved in that project that also link to our theme in terms of folklore. And those writers would be Richard Wright,
Yeah.
Ralph Ellison, and I'll throw in Margaret Walker. And they were involved in the project. If you look at their work stands on African American folklore.
That's exactly right.
And do you see them being like maybe the children of Sterling Brown or the
Well,
cousins?
Certainly I see those people connected. I would say Sam Allen, a mentee of Sterling Brown. You mentioned Richard Wright. It would be hard for Richard Wright not to know about the work of Sterling Brown.
There would be no blueprint for Negro writing.
Exactly. So it was interesting. In 1993, I think it was, there was a conference in Paris it was called African Americans in Europe. James, were you there? But you remember it, you know about it. And they were honoring Richard Wright there in Paris. And so the whole group of people went to an apartment that he used to live in, and they wanted to put a plaque on this house. And they got to the end, they read the plaque, they were going to dedicate it, and then, I wasn't on the program, my name wasn't on the program, I wasn't supposed to even be there, but I was there. And I was standing with a dear friend, Daryl Dance, who's a wonder. She is like the dean of folklore at this particular time. And it was almost over. And I realized that there hadn't been any music. So what did I do? I get out of the circle where we're dedicating this apartment plaque, and I go to the microphone, take it from the MC, and I said, we need a song. My mother didn't raise me well. And I knew there was an opera singer in the group. And I said, please, come up here. I'm remembering Sterling Brown, When the Saints Go Marching Home. And I said, we have to sing that. And she started, When the Saints Go Marching Home. And we all sang. And it became a ritual. It became the ritual that it was supposed to be. So I connected Richard Wright and Sterling Brown. I connected him to Sterling Brown because Sterling Brown talked about violence. He talked about the violence in the South. He talked about how black bodies were abused in the South.
Talk about Margaret Walker, because
Yes,
Margaret Walker
okay.
Alexander, she did a lot of the research for Richard Wright when he was writing his Black Boy, Native Son, rather. She sounds like, well, we had to wait for Alex Haley to do Roots before we really got a sense that she had written Jubilee. But
Right.
talk about her importance in terms of African American folklore.
Her and African American folklore, yes. Her signature poem, For My People, does a kind of chronology of Black people in this country. And when she recites that poem, that comes off as almost an anthem. It's an anthem of our struggles in this country. It reminds me that she and Sterling Brown are connected. For my people, strong men, old limb, cabaret, all those poems point to our history. And when you get to be almost 80 years old, you have so many stories, and I want to tell you just a snippet of a story about Margaret Walker. The last time I heard her read in Atlanta for the Black Arts Festival in Atlanta, just imagine Amir Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, Margaret Walker. I'm interviewing or in conversation with Margaret Walker, and at the end of the conversation, Amir Baraka, Eleanor Traylor, Sonia Sanchez are sitting together, and Amir Baraka says, "Miss Margaret, you have to read For My People." And she starts in on that poem. And when she finishes, Amir Baraka is crying. I'd never seen this man cry before. He's crying. People like Sterling Brown and Margaret Walker touch you at the very soul of your Blackness because it's so sincere, it's so real.
I want to ask you two more questions. I want you to, it's been 40 years, as I mentioned the first question, since your book came out. If you were critiquing your own book, your work, are there chapters that you feel that I should have expanded on? Are there things that, for example, you left out?
Absolutely. And I will confess to everybody here, when I finished that dissertation, and you know how they send you out of the room to deliberate, and then they bring you back in? Some of you know that, had that experience. And they brought me back in, and they said, this book is ready to be published. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying, but I had made a conscious decision that this book was not going to be filled with academic jargon. It was going to be written in such a way that people who didn't know anything about Sterling Brown could learn from it and pick up those things that were important. But I went on, and somehow, through the help of Henry Louis Gates and John Blassingame, it was published through Greenwood Press. And they took it from a press, I shouldn't even say the name, but Garland Press. Garland Press held my book for about 2 years and then said they wanted to put it in Xeroxographic form. And I said, no way. I had not published a thing, I had not published a book, but I was not going to allow them to publish the first book on Sterling Brown in xerosographic form. That meant they wanted to print it, and then later on they would maybe publish it. So I took it from them, and because of my adamant position on it, Henry Louis Gates and John Blassingame went from that press to Greenwood as guest editors, and they edited my book and published it.
I want to.
So, yeah. And so, what was the second part of your question?
Well, I'm going to give you. I'm going to open up to the audience in a second. But I wanted you to comment on something which I saw at Furious Flower, and then also it makes reference to what we saw earlier about Sterling Brown's influence on the Negritude poets, and that is the whole thing of where do we go now in terms of the international impact of Sterling Brown's work. Do we sail with African American folklore and trace that back to the Caribbean and back to Africa? But what are the jobs for new scholars emerging?
That's a wonderful question, and it was, it was what I wanted to say. This was supposed to be a seed piece. Is it Giselle? Mm-hmm. Giselle and scholars like her are going to pick up where I left off, where Mark Sanders and Edgar Tidwell left off. Now, Mark is still a young man. He has work to do. But I wanted this to encourage young scholars to do this work. But it's still, even to this day, the only sustained biocritical study of Sterling Brown, and that's a shame.
Let me ask
Isn't
you.
it? Hold on, one moment.
I'll hold on.
Who out there is expecting to do additional work on Sterling Brown? I'd like to see your hands. All right. We have a future. Talk about Afrofuturism. We have a future.
Okay. I wanted to, this ties into the research, using yourself as an example, and then some of the new scholars that are out there. To what extent did you use correspondence? I know we have the librarians there. There's a lot of correspondence. When I look at the work that Jeffrey Stewart did on Lane Rock, when I look at Alexis Gums, a lot of people now are going through the papers and correspondence and rediscovering different sides of some of these individuals.
I was so pleased recently when Imani Perry, who had been looking at some documents in his collection at Williams, sent me a picture of my daughter as a baby, 6 weeks old, that I turned into a Christmas card. And in 1973, I sent it to Sterling Brown. And he kept it and put it in his papers. Can you imagine how I felt seeing that card? I wanna say, I'm so glad, Laura, that you had that picture of Sterling and Daisy at their 50th wedding anniversary. I was there. And I'm still looking for the picture that Roy Lewis took of me dancing with Sterling Brown.
You can get it from him right now. He's back there.
Now, okay, Roy, I still am waiting for that picture.
Up against the wall, Roy. Up against the wall.
I'm still waiting for that picture. Honestly, I want to say this last thing, and then we can turn it to the audience. In 1985, after the publication of Sterling A. Brown, Building the Black Aesthetic Tradition, the first place I had to go to take that book was to 1222 Kearney Street. I took it up there, I rang the doorbell, a woman there was cleaning, and she said, "Sterling's not here." I said, I caught my breath, oh my God. She said, don't worry, he's right next door. He's at his sister's house. So I went next door, and I was able to hand that book to Sterling Brown. And Sterling said to me, well, Joanne, am I in the book?
We'll now take some questions from the audience.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, James.
Is there a mic? Is there a mic?
Wait, no, let me get that one. Okay.
So I'm not a scholar of Sterling Brown or anything else, but in an earlier, a longer piece that I was writing, Ethelbert mentioned Walter Rodney, Grounding with My Brothers. I mentioned in an earlier piece, Amilcar Cabral, Return to the Source. But here's a question, because I've been searching and thinking about Sterling for a long time, about his, what I like to call his personhood. All of these other expressions of his personhood, his profession, his research, his documentation, his writing, so forth and so on. In 1903, when Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk says, "Least you be confused, I'm bone of bone and flesh of those behind the veil." Powerful metaphor. But my sense is Sterling didn't give up being who he was born and what he was born into, but he went behind the veil and he became bone of bone and flesh of flesh. Now that's an undocumented projection. I would like to know what you think in terms of, I said to him, I think you committed class suicide. You didn't give up who you were, but Sterling became, unlike Langston Hughes, the people, not just talking about him. And I'd like to see if you have any thoughts on that possible transformational process.
I think his relationship with the people he met in his travels changed him fundamentally. I think that he saw their values, he saw their courage, and not that there wasn't courage in the middle-class existence that he grew up in, but it was magnified by what he saw in the people he met in the taverns, in the juke joints, in the fields. He became that Virginia portrait piece, so deeply embedded in their lives that were simple, but that were also showed courage, showed determination, showed those values that he wanted to see in himself, and therefore, and showed realness. And so when he got back to his colleagues and he saw them putting on airs, Carter G. Woodson was a fine person, but he put on airs. Sterling Brown wasn't like that. He was, what you saw is what you got. And so Sterling Brown, I think, valued what was genuine. And in doing that, it sort of changed who he was inside. Yeah, okay. I'm going to ponder that some more, but you're absolutely right. I think that's where you're leaning, right, James? Yeah, yeah. Another question.
We're going to take one more question.
Okay.
Because we're running behind time.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay, I'm going to be real quick then, because I don't actually have a question. I just want to say how important, obviously, everyone knows how important your work is to the scholarship of Sterling Brown. Many things you said spoke to me. Sister Lou was read at my mother's funeral, so I have that special connection to that poem in the same way that you do. I have a section in my thesis. The section is called Am I in the Book? and it's about the historiography of Sterling Brown. And a quick call back to a question earlier with the previous panel, talking about who is our Sterling Brown of today. I'm sure that question was from a creative perspective, but I want to say that my Sterling Brown is Ethelbert Miller, because when I was a student at Howard University, I climbed up those stairs to Founders Library many a days to have conversations with him, and they were so important: academic conversations, literary conversations, personal conversations. And one of the most important things that I saw in my research on Sterling Brown was his mentorship. And when you talked about the mentorship, particularly within the Federal Writers Project, that was something that was really important. And when you look at, from a cultural and a literary activist perspective, that person is Ethelbert Miller for us. So I'm so happy to be here with the two of y'all, and it's amazing.
I'm really sorry, but we are running like 30 minutes late.
Oh my goodness.
And in fairness to our other panelists and panels, and to also make sure you all don't leave until we're done.
This is, we're going to give you something. And this is the Esther Award. And it's the Esther Award is presented to Joanne V. Gabbin for her pioneering literary scholarship into the work of poet, critic, professor, and folklore Sterling A. Brown, for being the first lady of African American poetry and the founder of the Furious Flower Poetry Center, given by Esther Productions Inc, Jonetta, Barras, Ethelbert Miller, on the occasion of the Poetry and Folklore of Sterling A. Brown, a historical examination and celebration of a cultural legend, September 13, 2025, Trinity, Washington University. I'm very happy to give this award to you.